Welcome back to Bog Panda. A very special episode, I would say, because we're talking about one of our favorite topics, the Jaguar. If, like Kelly, you've invested,
Sorry.
that's perfect. If, like Kelly, you've invested your entire life savings in Atari tokens,
I have.
this is one of those episodes that's just for you.
That's right.
I am Dr. Mike at Official Pagan on everything. Joining me, as always,
Hi, everybody. I'm Kelly at KELLYTHUL on Twitter and Instagram. And we'd really appreciate it if you enjoy this video, give it a like and maybe consider subscribing to the channel as well. One of the things you'll find on this channel is YouTube does podcasts now. We've got the world's shortest podcast, scientifically proved by some double-blind test Mike mentioned in a recent show. I believe him. He's an honest man. But it is the world's shortest podcast. You can trust me on that. Hard No, check it out. It's really, really fun. When you're done doing that, maybe you want to get a T-shirt to show your support for Hard No. It's available on our merch store, so go check that out. And there you go. But let's talk Jaguar.
absolutely. So, Jaguar, I don't know where Kelly 100% falls on this. We both have the Atari collection, which is excellent. The 50th anniversary collection, can't recommend that enough. I'm a Jaguar fan though. It's a weird system. It's got a lot of weird bad games for it, and maybe the worst controller ever. But there's still a lot of cool things that it did though, and a lot of interesting things that came out on there. One of the things that didn't come out on there was a Mortal Kombat game. And this was actually, I remember this being advertised, and I saw somebody bring it up in another video recently. There was supposed to be a port of Mortal Kombat 3 to Jaguar that was announced at some point in video game magazines, but it never happened because Jaguar was already going under by that point. So we never got to see how Mortal Kombat would play on Atari Jaguar. And then I came across this interesting video of a gentleman making his own Mortal Kombat board to kind of give you an idea of what a Mortal Kombat on Atari Jaguar might look like. And what did you think when I sent this to you, sir? And where do you stand now that you played a few Jaguar games? Where do you stand on the system?
Yeah, I'm disappointed the system's no longer available. I'm jealous you have one. As I go to bed on top of my Atari tokens every night, I do feel like I want to have all the Atari systems around me, and that's one that is missing that I'd like to address. But when I've kind of looked at options for me to secure a Jaguar, as much as I'm interested in it, I'm not prepared to pay market price for a Jaguar right now. So I'm kind of hoping to catch a break at a ill-advised garage sale or thrift store or something at some point. But you haven't had a chance really to see much Jaguar stuff unless you have a Jaguar until something like the Atari 50th anniversary collection. And I echo what Mike said. That is, if you don't have it, get it. It's available on every platform, even the Atari VCS finally. But get it. It's great. It's fantastic. And it has a healthy dose of Jaguar games on it. First time you've really seen it. A lot of stuff there. But I mean, to me, it looks some of the titles look really, really good. I know they had some missteps on a few games with it. But yeah, I'm disappointed it didn't last longer. I probably had it stayed in market longer, I might have eventually picked one up. But because we've shared the war story before about I knew I had to buy the Virtual Boy. That was just, I must get it. And then I had a chance to actually experience what getting a Virtual Boy would mean in terms of gameplay, and I no longer wanted a Virtual Boy. Not the same thing with the Jaguar in terms of the experience. Looks good. Now, the controller, much documented. A lot of folks say there's a lot going on there that's not good. I would tend to agree, and that's a fairly important part of a gaming system experience is your controller. But
For anybody who doesn't know, it's not that the controller was unresponsive or anything like that. It's gigantic.
Yeah.
It's very large, unwieldy, and it's a weird shape. It's like a giant square.
Yeah, which is just that's gonna affect you every time you interact with it a little bit. So although I would assume there were probably some, well, I don't know, it wasn't in market long enough to know how much aftermarket stuff showed up, but you can maybe get some alternatives there. But no, I'm a fan of the system, and from what I've, I don't have as much direct experience, but it looks really, really cool. Um, like the history kind of behind it. Really wish it had stuck around a little longer. It kind of just showed up at a bad time in terms of what was going on, who was starting to emerge, and where the market was starting to go. So it was kind of Atari's last swing at staying relevant in the console game, and it didn't work out.
Yeah, it came out at a weird time right before PlayStation and things like that hit and just dominated the market. So it was never going to take over the market because PlayStation was already right around the corner, Xbox right behind that. So it was never going to compete with those systems. But unfortunately, it just got off to a really bad start on top of that because it had a weird architecture. They combined 64-bit and 32-bit chipsets, and they were run by a 16-bit chipset, which was intended to make it easier for game developers who were used to developing with 16-bit games. And instead, what they did was to cut corners and just dump stuff on there quickly, just port 16-bit games over to it instead of making better games that were actually tailored to the system. So that's really unfortunate. So it got off to a bad start. And by the time the good games kind of started coming out for it, the famous ones like Tempest 2000 and Alien versus Predator, by that point, you're already seeing PlayStation and things like that. So it was never going to take over the market. It is a shame though, because it's cool. It's an interesting system that obviously could do a lot of stuff. And you get now there's a gigantic Indian homebrew market for it, probably more so than any other system I can think of. And that's because Atari sold off the Jaguar to a medical company to use. They manufactured the consoles as medical equipment because of the weird chipset. But what they did was they didn't care about the gaming portion of it and just released their trademarks and copyrights on things. So it just opened it up for small indie companies and homebrew people to just make games for it completely legally and release them. So you can go online and find, I mean, almost all the time, there's new fully packaged Atari Jaguar games being released. So that is really cool that that's something that's continued on. And I guess it was cool of that company to just not care and kind of give that back to the gaming community.
Yep.
So all that's really cool. But what this video brings is something that is obviously a crazy missed opportunity because I think we could have gotten a great Mortal Kombat on Jaguar.
Yeah, and it was so the premise, and we're obviously going to include a link to the video in the description of ours here. But he's a sharp guy, and he's just basically going like, I thought I'd try and prove out whether you could or couldn't. Well, to me, kind of going into it is given the horsepower there wasn't for that generation of machines, even though the architecture was jacked up in terms of how it would work out. You had some serious horsepower going on there. You had decent sound capabilities as well. And so you certainly were going to have a very good shot.
Yeah.
But he, instead of just going my lazy way, going, yeah, I bet you it'd work, he'd say, I'm going to prove it. And so he focused on just kind of doing the character selection screen to begin with, and kind of ran through. But it was interesting to see. I was hoping that he's not like a hardcore game developer, but he's certainly knowledgeable enough to know how to deal with the assets, put them together, and kind of get them up and going. But it would be so we didn't get into here's how I dance around this couple 32-bit processors and all that kind of deal there. But I did. It's a great video. You guys should watch it. Possibly the highlight for me was about halfway through. There's a specific format that some of the files need to be in for the Jaguar. It's listed below right now, the format name. It begins with a T, as you can see, and he used some free Microsoft Paint packages and these types of things to do it. He couldn't get it done, and then he goes, but then I went back to Paint Shop Pro. And Paint Shop Pro had been my graphic tool for years. And I was using a super old version. And he was even using the same version that I used. And he ended up having to go, well, I did this stuff over here, and then I opened up Paint Shop Pro, brought it in, saved it out in the format that I needed to, because Paint Shop Pro could do it when nothing else could. So Paint Shop Pro shout out was awesome. Highlight of the video for me.
Yeah, no, that was cool because I remember using Paint Shop Pro as well. Does this mean we're going to get you developing an Atari Jaguar game, sir?
I got the Paint Shop Pro still around here somewhere, so that's step one. But I think I'm gonna concentrate more on the 8-bit games and the 16-bit games. There's some good tools out there. There's some important games coming out for you folks, which we'll announce on a future show that you're gonna want to experience. That's gonna probably be where I focus my efforts for a while.
Makes sense. Makes sense. But yeah, like to what Kelly was saying, I mean, there's really no, he does set it up as like, could it have run it? It absolutely could have, because regardless of, the argument over what was more important, the 64-bit chip or the 32-bit chips that ran the graphics and sound, it's certainly more powerful than a Genesis and Super Nintendo, and both of those ran Mortal Kombat very well, particularly the Genesis, and it's more powerful than those. So it absolutely could run Mortal Kombat. It's a question of how good would it be. Are we talking arcade perfect? And one of the cool things about Jaguar, and I believe they mentioned this in the archival footage that they include, or the interviews they include with the Atari 50th collection as well, is one of the things Jaguar went up against when it came out is because, PlayStation and Xbox and all that were right around the corner, you were starting to get that move into 3D graphics. Jaguar is not really made for 3D. They tried. They put out a bunch of 3D games on there, but those games obviously don't run as well for the most part as the 2D games do. It's really made for 2D games because they were already, it took them a while to develop Jaguar. It started as a completely different system that ended up getting canceled called the Panther, and then Jaguar came after that. So it was made for 2D, and technically, and I've seen this in multiple, I'm not a programmer, but I've seen multiple people quote this. Technically, in a 2D game environment, there's an unlimited number of sprites that the Jaguar can put on screen at the same time. Whereas there's a very strict limit number of sprites on even Sega and Super Nintendo and all that kind of stuff. If you remember back in the Nintendo days, screen flickering was a big problem with that stuff, and it would be because an extra sprite came on screen that it just couldn't handle, so it's freaking out trying to redraw everything, and it's skipping frames, and that's where you're getting that screen flickering. Super Nintendo wasn't a whole lot better. They got the flickering under control, but if you look at like side-scrolling games on Super Nintendo, there's never more than like 3 characters on screen at the same time and things like that. If you look at their ports of things like Final Fight and things like that, that's why there's a limited number of characters on screen so that doesn't happen. Technically, Jaguar doesn't have a limit. Now, it will affect performance. The more sprites you put on screen, it's going to start to slow down. But I mean, the fact that technically there's not a limit that they could hit on there does tell you the kind of horsepower it had. And it's a shame we didn't get to see big. It's awesome what's happening with the indie games and homebrew stuff, but it's a shame we didn't see something with a huge budget behind it to make a really great 2D game on the system.
Yep. It really is, because it could have handled it. And it maybe be the kind of thing, although it was tough again, it's time, you're now the best 2D game, home game console that there ever's been at the time when it's like, okay, but we're going 3D now,
Yeah.
And so it's like, which is a shame. So it just, it was a tough time for him, and so a little heartbreaking there. Awesome to see the homebrew community come out and kind of do some things there. This gentleman here, I think, proved without a doubt could have handled it. It would have been a very good version of it, near arcade quality, and it was. I thought he was actually unduly hard on himself when he was like, well, you see this character here, the motion's not Sub-Zero. He's not exactly the same as the arcade game because I had to drop 2 frames. And I'm like, dude, okay.
Yeah, I do think it's interesting you pointed that stuff out though, because
Yeah.
I mean, there are, to make it work on the hardware, there are certain changes and concessions that are going to have to be made. But dropping 1 or 2 frames of animation is still nowhere near how much had to be cut back to get it onto the 16-bit consoles.
Nope. And he kind of repeatedly also pointed out, with, I don't know, maybe a little too much confidence given the complexity architecture, but he kept reminding everybody, I'm not a developer. So I'm sure someone who's like really smart at doing development for the Jaguar would figure out a way that you wouldn't have had to drop those 2 frames. I just didn't know how, and I was needing to move on that kind of stuff. But yeah, it was cool to see. It is absolutely would have been awesome. But with the homebrew community out there, who knows? You may get it after all.
Bog Panda.